My name is Roger Buck, and today we're going to be talking about Pope Leo XIV. But not only that, we're going to be speaking about the crisis in the church that he inherits. It's a crisis that has been going on something like 60 years, at least, since the tremendous divisions that opened up in the church after Vatican II with, very different visions of what the Catholic Church should be. It's a wide-ranging crisis, from a liturgical crisis. As far as I'm concerned, that liturgical crisis is at the root of so much else. We'll be speaking about that. Sexual abuse crisis, the crisis that the modern world really wants to destroy the Catholic Church. Pope Leo XIV inherits all kinds of problems, which I fear have only been exacerbated in the last 12 years of the last pontificate. I say that because I do believe, and we'll be talking about this, that Pope Francis, God rest his soul, did, whether intentionally or not, foster the divisions in the church and cause all kinds of further divisiveness. Now, I need to say as well that none of us, I think, are innocent in that regard. But if you can remember what the church was like back in 2012, before Pope Francis came on the scene, you'll remember that, people everywhere were shocked by the kinds of things that Pope Francis began saying. No beating around the bush there. Popes had never, ever spoken like Pope Francis before. We're going to be going into that. Maybe I should also say, though, that we do live in an era of rhetoric that we've never seen before. All kinds of cheapening of public discourse from all kinds of, political figures and leaders, and all kinds of flaming on the internet. Pope Francis here forms part of a bigger picture, of which, as I say, none of us is innocent. But to start with Pope Leo XIV, I'm going to say that personally speaking right now, I am very, very, very deeply moved by our new Holy Father. Does that mean that I believe our new Holy Father is some kind of super pope who is going to be able to sort out all the terrible problems in the church over these last decades? No, ladies and gentlemen, I don't believe anything of the sort. In fact, as I'm recording this video, it's now only something like 6 days into Pope Leo's pontificate. It's very, very early, and I'm hoping to turn this around in something like 2 or 3 days, get it out this weekend. This is Wednesday now, which is kind of like record time for me. Things could have already changed enormously by the time you see this. What we can see of Pope Leo XIV is that he's not been very vocal over the years. Arguably he's, held his cards close to his chest. Who knows when we are really going to be seeing what he intends to do. At this point, this is not at all clear. And that gives me real concerns about making this video. In fact, I have concerns for all kinds of reasons, ladies and gentlemen. This video is something of a new departure for me. I haven't really quite ever done anything like this. I prefer to do videos that take in a bigger sweep of history rather than reporting on current events that I'm not sure I'm qualified for. But we're going to wade in with a very kind of personal account. And for what little it is worth, I am feeling real hope about this pontificate. I've been deeply, deeply moved. And it seems that other people are too. But what does that really mean? We're going to have to wait for more objective confirmation of what's really been going on here. But speaking subjectively, I have felt deeply moved almost from the moment our new Holy Father stepped out onto the loggia. And it's not impossible that my subjective impressions, and perhaps your subjective impressions, ladies and gentlemen, reveal the truth here. ValentinTomberg would actually call that transsubjective. Truths that one feels through one's subjective impressions. But we need to be cautious. It's very clear at this early stage that this is a pope who had broad support from all kinds of cardinals, including cardinals very much on the progressive wing of the spectrum who are expecting continuity from Leo XIV. Father James Martin, Cardinal Kupish have come out, others have come out in profound support of Leo XIV. Being yet, there is support from other cardinals as well that are nowhere near as progressive as Cardinal Kupish. Cardinals like Cardinal Dolan and Cardinal Burke. I'm going to be saying in this video that we need to listen to world events with both our heart and our head. Listening with my heart, and my heart can be wrong. Listening with my heart, or my heart may not see the full picture here, to say the least. Listening with my heart, I feel we have a pope of real humility, real kindness. I feel we have a pope who is spiritual. He comes from the contemplative order of the Augustinians, and my heart can feel that contemplative quality within him. I don't come from a contemplative order, but I'm going to say as an aside here that my wife and Kim do aspire to be contemplatives. I'll say this is maybe relevant to something later on. My wife and I, no, we're not part of an order, but we do think of ourselves as hermits. Hermits in retreat from the world. I sometimes speak about ourselves as hermits with a broadcasting tower, because we come out on YouTube and we put these things out, or on our website and so on and so forth. But we try to aspire to a contemplative life, and I normally want to contemplate things for a much longer time. That is one of several conundrums I have in coming out in this video and speaking so incredibly quickly, with a video that could even be outdated by the time it's out there, although I do intend to go into much, much deeper and long-lasting problems in the church, so it won't be outdated in that sense. Look, before I go on, in terms of what I just said about hermits with a broadcasting tower, that, we aspire to this contemplation, but we also aspire to creative work, putting things out there. I have an announcement I want to make that I'm excited about. That is that my wife Kim and I are also going to be going onto Substack. And by the time this video comes out, at the weekend I hope, we should already be on Substack, at least in a rudimentary fashion. So there will be a Substack link in the links down below. Please, if you're interested in what we're doing here, take a look at our new Substack. I'm excited because it looks to me like Substack is going to allow us to do all kinds of things we haven't done before. There's going to be podcasts there. There's going to be, voice recordings. And through the kind of social media notes section of Substack, we're going to be doing things on a daily basis. Now, at the moment, Substack is free. At some point, we will be asking for paid subscribers, but I imagine that nearly all of what I'm doing on Substack, we're doing on Substack, at least most of it, will remain free. But yes, we are seeking to raise funds for this little apostolate that I call Hermits with a Broadcasting Tower. And on that note, I will also mention that we do have a Buy Me a Coffee page, if you can support us in that way as well. But anyway, I'll be saying more at the end of the episode about the work that we are aspiring to do here now through this Substack as well. Before moving on, I want to say just a little bit more about this wave. What is this wave of support for Pope Leo XIV that even seems to be coming from some of the most traditionalist corners of the internet. People that you would think would not really be supporting Pope Leo XIV, especially at this stage when he has said so little. It may seem that this won't matter much in the future, this initial wave of support, but I think it does matter to things that I want to speak to a great deal in this episode about the crisis of the church and the shadows in the church. Look, I'll give you an example of what I mean by this wave of support. It's just one individual. But there is an individual, calls himself a New Catholic at 𝙘𝙧𝙞𝙨𝙞𝙨. I've been reading 𝙘𝙧𝙞𝙨 for something like 20 years. A prodigious effort has gone into 𝙘𝙧𝙞𝙨, New Catholic, and, helped and assisted by people like Joseph Shaw and Peter Kwasniewski. I have gained so much from their efforts. And I clearly remember the night Pope Francis was elected in 2013, and almost immediately, New Catholic, who has contacts with all kinds of networks of people over the planet, came out with what seemed to many people inappropriate comments right from the start about Pope Francis's papacy. Many people judged him at the time for doing that. But he had this information and he put it out there almost immediately. I've been looking at what New Catholic has been saying about Pope Leo XIV, and I'm actually really very deeply touched by it. I think what he's been saying is lovely. and it shows the heart of a man who can see the heart of another man. That's what I think. We're going to be coming back to this kind of, crisis in the church where traditionalists have been so incredibly critical of the last papacy. We've been talking about that a lot. The point I want to get to now is that when people like New Catholic and many others are saying what they're saying about Pope Leo are saying what they're saying about Pope Leo, what's really going on here? Well, I think, ladies and gentlemen, part of it is what I'm saying, that the heart can see what is in this, our new Holy Father. But I think there's also a factor of an enormous wave of relief. I think many of us were bracing ourselves for Cardinal Parolin, for a pope who looked like he would be Pope Francis II. And it feels to people, like myself, like a dark cloud has been lifted from the papacy. And I'm going to say something that may shock some of you. A dark cloud has been lifted from the world. So I'm saying things that may really startle some of you, because, ladies and gentlemen, I've opted, rightly or wrongly, to keep quiet about my true feelings here. Over years. And my true feelings, I'll just say right now, they do acknowledge many good and indeed even beautiful at times things that Pope Francis did. I absolutely support Pope Francis's stance against the dictatorship of global capitalism. There are some people who think that this was some unprecedented thing in the church. If you really look at, the kind of things that Pope Benedict XVI said and St. John Paul II before him, you will find also a great critique of global capitalism. So it's not exactly that, Pope Francis was new in this way, but he could say things in a more popular way. And I applaud many of the things he said there, or said things on behalf of the, environment, Laudato Si', or, encouraging people to Mass, confession. It said that, Pope Francis, spent a lot of time in Eucharistic adoration. He did speak out, in defense of life, although certain of his actions that we will be coming to here appear to contradict that. We're going to be looking at these things. I am intending now to speak out more about this last pontificate because it's part of history now. It's part of history. And I really chose not to speak out, rightly or wrongly. Look, before I go on, ladies and gentlemen, I want to run you a clip, maybe a couple of clips, of one of the only times on this channel that I really did speak about this papacy. And I was kind of tormented to speak about this. But if I run these clips to you, they will help set the scene for what I'm about to say. So I will just tell you that the nature of these clips was that I did this episode when Traditionalist Custodes came out. I felt I could no longer keep silent about this papacy. All right? You had a situation there that with Traditionalist Custodes, Pope Francis was going directly in 180 degrees, the opposite direction of Pope Benedict XVI. And, maybe he sincerely and deeply believed that that was for the benefit of the church. But what do you do when, you have two popes saying things that are pretty much 180 degrees the opposite? What do you do about that? What do you do, when the Pope is trying to, I think it's apparent from the documents that came out, not only Traditionalist Custodes, but the other document that came out, that the hope was there that the Latin Mass would die out. And these are very, very serious matters here, ladies and gentlemen. As I said already, I think the liturgical crisis in the Church is at the heart of so much else. But look, let me just run you these few minutes from the past to set the stage for how we're going to continue here. Now, in talking about these things, I personally face a conundrum, a moral conundrum. A conundrum between two opposites, two opposed visions. Because what we have here with this motu proprio is a vision that runs completely opposite, it would seem to me, to the vision of Pope Benedict XVI for healing the Church in this time of crisis. And, clearly the vision that I am holding in my own tiny, meager way is not in agreement with what Pope Francis has expressed in the motu proprio and the letter that accompanies it. And I say this is a conundrum because Catholicism is about obedience. Whether it's the obedience of a monk to his abbot, or to a bishop, or to the Holy Father, Catholicism is about obedience. So, how do I speak about this? Must I remain silent? That is a question that I have been asking myself, as much as it might surprise some of my viewers. I'll come back to that. Must I remain silent? Because, to be honest, friends, for the most part, what I've been doing for quite a number of years is choosing, rightly or wrongly, choosing the path of silence. Unusually for many traditionalist writers, authors, such as myself, if you go through, or commentators, if you go through this YouTube channel, you will be hard-pressed to find any criticism of Pope Francis on this channel. The same is true of my website. There is one major exception here. That exception is my recent novel, The Gentle Traditionalist Returns, because in that novel is really, it's hardly a novel, I mean it is a novel. I tend to think of it as a manifesto for what I think about the Church and the world in this time of crisis. In this novel, so-called novel, I have a character called Anna. And in a few places, not many places, Anna's kind of like my heroine, really. Anna does express things that I have so far been, to a large extent, silent about. And I want to just share a couple of quick things from the novel, manifesto. So, Just a very brief line here. Anna hardly knew how to talk about Pope Francis. She believed in loyalty to the Holy Father and refused to reveal her true feelings regarding him to anyone except me. That's her husband. I haven't gone as far as Anna, but nonetheless, she does express how I feel, or maybe how I'd like to be. In many ways in the book, she expresses, as I say, she's my heroine in a way. But before we go forward, I'm just going to point to and comment on one other passage in the book, which is relevant. Much had changed for the worse since the shocking resignation of Pope Benedict XVI in 2013 led to the new papacy of Pope Francis. That new papacy created a new ecclesiastical climate, a more progressive one that empowered liberal voices. It also led to what looked like civil war. Utter chaos reigned in the church. The church was divided and thereby crippled, Anna said. All right, I'd like to just repeat that last line that I said about the church being divided in herself and thereby crippled. There are different reasons that I just showed you all of that, but one thing I'm driving at here, ladies and gentlemen, is that I think there are signs here, potent signs, of a far less divisive Pope. A man who is contemplative, a man who knows how to listen, a man who is kind and wants to build bridges. And all the time I'm saying that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very much at least implying that his predecessor was not like that. This, as I say, is part of history now. I imagine that there could be those listening to this thinking I'm hyperbolic here. What am I speaking about? A dark cloud has been lifted. Not just from the church, but from the world. Isn't this outrageous, Roger? Some of you who might have more of a kind of psychological orientation, in the sense of, say, Jungian psychotherapy, and I've been in Jungian therapy and it's marked me, would think in terms of shadow projections. If one says things like this, is one maybe not projecting the image of one's own shadow onto the papacy? Surely, Roger, some people might be thinking, how irrational of you to speak in some of those terms. I'm not doing it without praying and thinking about this, ladies and gentlemen, without struggling about it. And if I begin to speak about these things like a dark shadow being lifted, it's not because, now that the Pope is part of history, I can kind of rant and vent about him. I think that it's necessary, at least I'm praying it's necessary, to begin illumining the state of this civil war in the church that Pope Leo is inheriting. Okay? It takes two to tango. There's a lot of talk from people who don't see this last papacy in the way that I see it, to ask, why are traditionalists, so nasty? Why are they so abusive? And I absolutely admit that traditionalists can be abusive and nasty. It's why I wrote my books, The Gentle Traditionalist. And maybe, some of you will think I'm now going in this direction as well. But I'm going to amplify. I want to amplify this whole tragic nature of the church. I said at the outset that how Pope Francis began speaking in 2013 was absolutely shocking. People may not remember this. In a time now where we have Trump and all kinds of other people, in certain ways Pope Francis, could be seen as a precursor to Trump, on the left. All of this has become normalized. I said something to the effect that, we've never had a pope like this. Well, I can't say that. Maybe in the Middle Ages we did have popes like this. But in recent, generations, Popes have been noted for their diplomacy, for their measured, considerate statements, and for Pope Francis to really start coming out with outrageous things. It's like he's known in the media, for, this single kind of thing of, telling Catholics that they were breeding like rabbits, simply by following Catholic doctrine about the family, they were breeding like rabbits. That is a famous, or infamous, should I say that? Anyway, famous statement of how I would see Pope Francis as being very divisive. But the truth is, if you were following this very, very closely, and we're going to present both sides here, we're going to talk about how traditionalists are divisive as well, all right? But if you were following this closely, you would see that this comment about breeding like rabbits, that the media was very happy to report, was like the tip of an iceberg of all kinds of things the media did not report. In fact, somebody's collected all these things over the years, or many of these things, and they've created a site called the Pope Francis Little Book of Insults, or they've actually changed it to the Bumper Book of Insults. These are things that Pope Francis was speaking. The things here that happened again and again and again. So, these were things that Pope Francis used to address people who saw things differently from him. Old maid, fomenter of coprophagia. Very, very crude kinds of things here. Specialist of the Logos. Rosary counter. Now, I remember when he said that, he was berating Catholics for counting their rosaries, a time-honored Catholic practice. Functionary. Self-absorbed Promethean Neo-Pelagian. Restorationist. Mr. and Mrs. Weiner, rigid Christians, triumphalist, modern Gnostics, liquid Christian, superficial Christians, museum mummy, leprous courtier, long-faced, mournful funeral Christian, Gnostic, authoritarian, pickle pepper-faced Christian. We won't go on. I want people to remember that popes, at least in modern memory, never did things like this. And these things are the tip of an iceberg. As I tried to sort of be with his papacy over the years, ladies and gentlemen, I tried to read around it. I did read Henry Seyer's book, The Dictator Pope, but I also read books like, John L. Allen's, I got this book and studied it, the Francis Miracle. I try to sort of not be in the echo chamber. I try to read around what this Pope was doing. And this is a conclusion I've come to, ladies and gentlemen. If you're one of those people, you're not a traditionalist, and you really do see, and yes, there is a problem here. There's a real problem here of traditionalists being angry and at times vicious. It's possible that you're not seeing all these sides of what this last papacy is. You're not seeing the different sides of the civil war in the church that I am now praying. I am now really praying that Pope Leo XIV can begin to address with a contemplative, listening heart, building bridges. I'm praying for that. We're going to come back to all kinds of possibilities with Leo XIV, but what I want to do right now is say more, to lay out some of the issues that are, I think, really involved here. Yeah, so my point is, if you don't read around, if you just stay in one echo chamber, let's just say, you just read the National Catholic Reporter or John L. Allen, on the left, or if you just read people on the right, you won't have a full picture. I have at least struggled to get as full a picture as I can. I say that, ladies and gentlemen. I have to say that I did this very intensively in the first 2 or 3 years of this papacy. In recent years, and this is another reason why maybe I shouldn't be doing this video, and we'll come back to this, I think, as well. In recent years, I felt so deeply depressed by what I saw was going on this papacy in many fronts, that I began to tune out. I began to focus, no, I'm going to say this as well, ladies and gentlemen, just before we go on. This is another reason that I have like a conundrum in making a video like this. The videos that I try to do on this channel are videos about topics where if I'm not an authority or if I'm not an expert, I've at least sought to develop my expertise. I've at least sought to develop my authority. I have truly sought to develop myself so that I can speak about ValentinTomberg, or Hilaire Belloc, or the New Age movement, or Irish history, or other topics, the kind of globalization, or, what I'm controversially suggesting in these videos is often a kind of Anglo-Americanization of the world. We're still coming up to that in a video that I've been working on for weeks. Anglo-American anti-Catholic ideology. That's still in the pipeline. I have really put real effort over the years into pondering these things. But I do ask myself, in a question like this, I paid very deep attention, I hope, to Pope Benedict's papacy and the early years of Pope Francis's papacy, but I began to tune out. I have to admit that. I felt other tasks I needed to take care of. So there are so many things in this papacy that I'm not really competent to speak about, ladies and gentlemen. I will refer to some of them. But I'm going to really try to pepper what I say with phrases like, I gather this, or I have the impression that, or it appears to me, because I am frankly less competent here. I could not really describe to you in a way that would satisfy me anyway what happened with the Vatican, with this deal with communist China. I have the impression that something very dark happened there, but I have not, studied it in the depth it deserves. So, not having expertise here, I have to rely on other sources. I do try to read around, and we're going to bring you some dark things from things that, I have been reading around over the years. Not because I want to radically vent about Pope Francis, but because I think we need to understand the situation that Pope Leo has inherited. And maybe in the terms of bridge building, we need to understand why traditionalists, can be so very, very upset. I think that one of the things here, ladies and gentlemen, is that, I'm not saying it's the only thing, is that often traditionalists are paying attention. They're paying attention to sources that are not in the media. Either the media could care less about reporting them, or the media is actively not interested in reporting them. I do think that many traditionalists are far more informed than people realize, and that is a reason for the outrage and, yes, some of the bitterness that does exist, absolutely does exist. Anyway, yes, I have a book here, The Dictator Pope, from Henry Sire. I'm going to just read something here that is the kind of thing that isn't going to get into the media really very much. Because I mentioned at the beginning that, of course, Pope Francis did say all kinds of pro-life things. But there are reports that he acted in very different ways. I don't know if all the reports are true. I don't, claim that everything in this book is true. But having considered it, I think there's a lot of substance here. So, Henry Sire, for example, is speaking about the Pontificia Academia Pro Vita, if I pronounce that correctly with my terrible Latin, founded by John Paul II. And he really goes into, pro-life, foundation, to understand pro-life issues. He really speaks about how Pope Francis radically changed this institute. I think I will just, we're not going to dwell on this, but I'm going to read one quote here anyway. The American doyen of pro-life activists, Judy Brown of the American Life League, was another of the original corresponding members of the Pontificia Academia Pro Vita, who, she commenced in February 2017 to say that Pope Francis has deconstructed this institute with his new statutes and membership appointments, saying it is one of the most heartbreaking events I have seen in my lifetime. But given the politics of the Vatican, it is not surprising. She's talking about 1 aspect of papal policy over these last, 12 years as the most heartbreaking event, where some of us are coming from, ladies and gentlemen, at least, is that there were many, many, many heartbreaking events for those of us who were watching this closely. And I think the language of heartbreak, is the best language to use here. I tried to use it over the years. I don't know why Pope Francis and the people in the Vatican have acted, his appointees in the Vatican have acted the way they did, but I can say that many of us feel heartbroken. My wife recently did this video, or rather it's audio only, on Traditionis Custodes, speaking about her real heartbreak that so many of us feel about Pope Francis's efforts to utterly reverse what Benedict did. I hope by explaining these factors, this side of the civil war in the church, maybe it can help. And I question myself. But look, I said before that I have gained a very great deal from Rorati Caeli over the years. The prodigious effort made by Rorati Caeli for 20 years. I've got some printouts here from a long post last year where they went into the numerous cases where it seemed, that Pope Francis was shielding sexual aggressors in the church. I want to say this was not really, as far as I can see, mentioned much in the media, because the media was, it often seems to me, hell-bent on celebrating Pope Francis. He was Time Magazine's Man of the Year, if I recall correctly. I think very little of this came to light in the mainstream media. For what little it's worth, maybe this is worth something. As I said, I followed Pope Benedict XVI's papacy very, very closely, and the first few years of the Pope Francis papacy, I really had the impression that Pope Benedict was appalled by the sexual abuse crisis in the church and was taking very, very strident, tough measures. The media continuously lambasted Pope Benedict and then went silent on Pope Francis. This is my opinion. And he was able to, it seems to me, I have the impression, be far more lax in these things. But I'm not an authority here. I've not studied this. But I don't think Rorati Caeli is making all this up. And there's a long piece here. And we're just going to refer to just a couple of cardinals here. Not even necessarily the most notorious ones. So a little sentence or two about Cardinal Reinhard Marx. Cardinal Marx admitted to having covered up. He admitted this. Unless Rorati is lying to us, and I don't believe they are. I actually feel Rorati has been very scrupulous over the years. Anyway, Cardinal Marx admitted to having covered up many sexual abuse cases when he was Bishop of Trier. He admits this, and offered his resignation to Pope Francis in 2021, giving this cover-up as the reason. Pope Francis refused his resignation, and Marx continues as the Metropolitan Archbishop of Munich and Freising. Alright, there are loads of them here, but including the Carrick and everything that happened there, you can find it on Rorati Caeli. But we're going to go into one of the more notorious ones that, even though the mainstream media has not been speaking about it much, some of you will certainly be aware of. Father Marco Rupnik, he's sometimes being dubbed Rapnik now. Multiple accusations of sexual and physical assault of nuns, dating back 3 decades, have been made against Father Marco Rupnik, Jesuit, a well-known artist. Rupnik's criminal acts manifested exceptionally abhorrent sacrilege and cruelty. That is my impression from, I'm no expert. I have not spent weeks of my life digging into, Father Rupnik. But from what I've seen, this accusation of cruelty, is very, very true. The Jesuits conducted an internal investigation into the accusations against Rupnik, and in May 2019, they determined that the accusations against him were credible. The conclusions of the investigation were forwarded to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at that time. One of the crimes was the absolution of an accomplice in a sin against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue, speaking in a circumspect way. This crime carries the penalty of automatic excommunication. In January 2020, he was judged to have committed the crime. Rupnik was invited to preach a Lenten retreat to priests working at the Vatican in March 2020, despite being excommunicated at the time. So, the Pope is inviting this man. In May 2020, his excommunication was lifted. Excommunication for this crime can only be lifted by the Apostolic See. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a very, very, very dark morass of things here, in my opinion, and I can thank God that it is not the main purpose of this channel to explore these things. My work mainly lies elsewhere. But I want to say something more about my own personal struggle here. I said on that video clip from, is it 5 years ago now, 6 years ago, with Traditionis Custodes, I said something like this: rightly or wrongly, I have been keeping silent. I really do ask myself, ladies and gentlemen, if I was wrong. If I was wrong. Should I have been speaking out more? I'm going to make a plug for something here. Both Peter Kwasniewski and Aroka Press, a very fine publisher, Aroka Press, have brought out these 2 volumes on the Francis Papacy by Peter Kwasniewski, collecting a lot of his articles over the years. A lot of his articles. They make very worthwhile reading. Seeing the extensive fronts that the Vatican has been very, very destructive over these last 12 years. We have lived through an unprecedented papacy, the like of which I don't know if maybe it's completely unprecedented, but there have been terrible papacies in the past. Does this mean that I necessarily accept everything Peter Kwasniewski says here? No. Does this mean that I always agree with his choice of language? No. Does this mean that I respect him as somebody who seems to me exceptionally awake to what's been going on? Yes, I do respect him for that. I do respect him for that. This is somebody who really has spent the time delving into things. If you're someone who is looking at traditionalists, and there are plenty of people like that, including from the comments, I can see certain people on this channel saying, what is going on here? Why are traditionalists like the way they are? I want to suggest that there are different reasons, and that they may be aware of a much broader range of issues than is getting into our mainstream media. I want to suggest that maybe their hearts are pierced and outraged. Does that lead them sometimes to speak in ways that aren't always wise? Certainly it does. Certainly it does. But before we begin judging these people, I would like to invite us to really contemplate. If you're not somebody who, really reads Rorati Caeli, a new Catholic, maybe go and take a look and contemplatively ask, why are they doing this? Why are they putting this? The people at, Rorati Caeli, as I say, Peter Kwasniewski, Joseph Shaw, other people are there as well. Why are they putting this prodigious effort over many years? Maybe it's because their hearts are really awake to not just one heartbreaking tragedy in the course of this papacy, but many, on many fronts at once. Alright, it's the next day now. I've been reviewing what I did yesterday. I've been editing it, asking questions. Did I go too far in what I said? Did I not go far enough? Was I not clear? One thing that I need to say before we kick off, we're going to really be focusing more on Pope Leo today. But when I spoke about these heartbreaks within the last 12 years, there were all kinds of things that I did not mention. I did not speak about Pope Francis running roughshod over doctrine. I did not speak about Pope Francis choosing all kinds of bishops and cardinals that have shifted the church in a far more progressive direction. It was clear in the run-up to the conclave, when you saw the things being passed around, that the cardinals some of them were saying things that would have been outrageous, absolutely outrageous in the reigns of Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict. Clearly, there's a mighty difference there, and if you feel about the church the way I do, it's a dangerous difference. I have not said anything about, the whole synodal process, synodality. I will just say now that I consider this to have a very grave danger for the church. And I think we're going to come back to that, probably come back to it in a way that ValentinTomberg spoke about these things. But there are all kinds of holes missing here. But my purpose, ladies and gentlemen, is not to do a mighty deconstruction of the last 12 years. My purpose here is, at least one of my purposes, is that if I can really explain, how I am seeing these last years and how I think many of us are seeing these last years, it may help explain this wave of relief and joy coming about Pope Leo from even very traditional people, who you would not think would be supportive of our new Pope. A Pope who is, clearly backed by progressives, and a Pope whom we know very little about yet, and whom we have to be cautious about. I'm hoping that I made that clear in what I was saying, that just because I am subjectively and personally tremendously moved by this Holy Father, doesn't mean that I'm blind to those factors. But it does have a lot to do with how I feel and how others feel about these last 12 years. So I came out very honestly and spoke about a dark cloud being lifted from the church and even from the world, which, may sound outrageous to some of you. I hope, if you've got this far, that what I've said will clarify why I said that. That, ladies and gentlemen, that as broken and as fallen and as messed up, as the human side of the church is, we may need to say more about the sexual abuse as well. As broken and as fallen as this is, in a world that looks to me ever more dystopian, the church is my only hope. So personally, it was very easy for me to get very depressed about this papacy. So much so that I didn't want to look at certain things in the last years. And so all of my hope and all of my being moved, everything I'm saying here, this has to be factored into it. Maybe I just say this about the sexual abuse. I spoke about this in the Killing Catholic Ireland episode with my wife Kim, and we're going to be speaking more about this. I'm going to be speaking more about this. But in a church of 400,000 priests across the planet, there are something like 400,000 Catholic priests. In a fallen world, you are bound to get some very, very, very rotten apples. What is scandalous, I think, is how many of them have been, elevated to bishops, elevated even to cardinals. And in speaking about Pope Francis here, and speaking about Pope Francis, like, did I go too far? Did I not go far enough? What I quoted there about, Cardinal Marx or Father Rupnik, there are plenty of other people where the most charitable thing you can say about Pope Francis is that he was being nowhere near vigilant enough. And as I say, I do think that Pope Benedict was doing far, far, far better on this than Pope Francis was. And Pope Francis, existed in a media culture that celebrated his every move, and he could afford to go lax, very, very lax about this terrible thing again. But I won't keep rehearsing that. What I'm really trying to do here, ladies and gentlemen, is give context. Context for the hope I'm feeling. As I said, my hope is not for a super pope who is going to fix everything going wrong in the church. My hope is that the church can be saved from the abyss. And I dare to wonder if she has just been saved from the abyss. I was very, very with that we could well have a cardinal like Parolin, very, very much a complete continuity candidate who would take the church in all the same directions. This dangerous synodal process, the church was really on the edge of the abyss, and the next papacy could tip us over the abyss. That was my feeling, and I now have cautious hope that maybe that's not going to happen. And for me, it's like I'm overjoyed. It's given me hope. It's given me hope not just for the church, but for the world. That's where I'm coming from. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to bring in St. John Paul II now, who, in my view, was a saint, was a very great and holy man. Doesn't mean that he didn't make terrible mistakes. Doesn't mean that at all. I think in the necessary nature of the papacy, the tremendous, tremendous stress. If I were, God forbid, to become Pope, I would crack like an eggshell within a few hours or a few days at most. St. John Paul II, I don't know what to say. There are mistakes there, but I have no doubt about his holiness. In fact, I recall once saying in a social media echo chamber, it was largely an American one, I recall, that I thought that St. John Paul II had more morality and love in his little finger than I have in my entire body. And I make this tribute to St. John Paul II now for different reasons. One, the best possible scenario, and I doubt we have this. I may be moved by a sense of humility, kindness, contemplativeness, spirituality in Pope Leo, but I don't know how strong a man he is. St. John Paul II was a very, very strong man as well. Benedict XVI, Pope Benedict XVI, right at the beginning of his pontificate, said words to the effect, just quiet words, but they were said there. Pray that I do not flee from the wolves. And he meant, I'm sure, wolves in the Vatican. Wolves in the Vatican. And I fear, ladies and gentlemen, that the wolves in the Vatican have only grown greater in number and more ferocious than ever. I hope that's only my fear. Can Pope Leo XIV stand up to these wolves in the Vatican? We will have to wait and see. But, yeah, it would be a miracle for me. It would be a miracle if, there are, comparisons are being made. In my opinion, they're too premature, they're too early to think of Pope Leo XIV as a compromise candidate, similar to St. John Paul II in 1978. This is one of the kinds of concerns I have. Look, I'm just going to bring this out. I'm going to bring this out. I do fear that the reason why, I shocked people, or I've shocked people in certain things that I've said over the years in, social media echo chambers, I think particularly American social media echo chambers about St. John Paul II, is that you get in these echo chambers and all you ever hear are negative things about St. John Paul II. People in an echo chamber who are not reading, are not studying history, they're not reading books, they're listening to other people in the echo chamber. I think it's just worthwhile saying that, the church, in my study of history, in the 1970s looked very much on the same direction towards the abyss, and St. John Paul II turned so much around. And maybe while I'm also on this topic, I'm going to bring up this as well, ladies and gentlemen. There's a tendency, I think, a naive tendency, to think that traditionalism, as we know it, is simply like a reflection of the timeless principles of the church, the timeless tradition. If Vatican II hadn't got in the way, and so on and so forth. I do think that is very naive indeed. As I've said in other videos, I do think there is the danger, at least, of a traditionalist groupthink, where what's going on, what's seen as simply a reflection of timeless principles, is really a reflection of very much our own time and culture. So, in many of these American social media chambers, I see a reflection of, America in the 2020s and what's going on. I've spoken about this before. People speaking about Donald Trump as a new Constantine. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. So for me, and it's one of the graces of my life, ladies and gentlemen, is that I can at least read and understand French. My ability to speak it with a decent accent is pretty darn poor. But, I've spent time looking at French stuff, being with French stuff, and it's so different there. I've been moved again and again and again by how much gratitude I see amongst French traditionalists for everything that St. John Paul II did. So, when we speak about traditionalism, what do we mean? Do we mean American traditionalism? Do we need French traditionalism? Do we mean Italian traditionalism? These things vary from place to place and culture, culture to culture. And yes, some of the people that I have coming onto these videos, there's been some comments recently speaking, about how angry and bitter a lot of traditionalists seem. There are all kinds of reasons for that. As I say, I do think Pope Francis was extraordinarily abusive. When you really look at it, extraordinarily abusive. At times, anyway. But there are these echo chambers. And, the French echo chambers, they exist as well. They're different from the American echo chambers. Anyway, enough of that. I think my real point here is we may not, I think it would be far, far, far too much if I were to dare to hope that in Pope Leo XIV we had another spiritual giant of the nature of John Paul II, St. John Paul II, but we do have a hope. We have a hope of some kind of breathing space, at least breathing space, from the last 12 years. All right, I guess by now it will be becoming clear. So much of my reaction here is because I had at least in part, I had the bar set very low indeed. I really never had any hope, ladies and gentlemen, for a Cardinal Sarah to come to be the Pope, or a Cardinal Erdo, or someone who was going to revert everything. I was really fully prepared for a Paroline as Pope Francis II. In my darker moments, I was thinking of Pope Francis III, Pope Francis IV, Pope Francis V. This is the way I was thinking. I am going to qualify that, though, with a rather strange remark. This was certainly the way I was thinking in 2024. But starting in 2025, as I contemplated all this, I began to think differently, or slightly differently. Something I said to my wife is that if Pope Francis had died in 2024, I would have been reasonably sure of Francis II. All right? And for all we know, Pope Leo is going to be Francis II. I don't think he is, to be honest. I don't think he is. I think we see enough now that we can be sure that there's a difference of some kind. But why 2025? Well, this might make some sense to some of you, ladies and gentlemen. It might make no sense to others. But in the depths of my prayer and contemplation, I feel this enormous shift in the world process. Some of that is manifested in this new Trump administration, with some good things, with some bad things, some very bad things. For example, what Trump is speaking about turning the Gaza Strip into a hotel, into a Mediterranean resort. I won't get going about that. But the world has changed. The world has changed in 2025, it feels to me, in quite a mighty way. And I was saying to my wife before this, if this were 2024, I'd have really no hope, or very little hope, for anything different. But I said to her, because the world has changed so much, I won't be surprised if this papal election somehow reflects that change. And I feel this has happened now, or I dare to feel, that we are now possibly seeing a real change in the direction of the Vatican that I could not have hoped for in 2024. So I make those rather cryptic comments, ladies and gentlemen. I think I just want to say something else, though, about my being so, again, deeply moved by my sense of spirituality and contemplativeness and kindness and decency in our new Holy Father. I don't know, ladies and gentlemen. It's like if I was coming to this late and I was seeing this kind of wave of approval of Pope Leo, I think I'd be skeptical. I think I would be saying, well, aren't you sort of taking too seriously, certain nods to tradition, even if they are sincere? Aren't you maybe overrating certain things? But it's often like with world events, I actually do come in late. I don't actually look at things until they've transpired 3 or 4 or 5 days later. But this one I was watching from the beginning. My wife, I'm just going to add another personal note, and I were there, watching this election. We were both emotional. She was more emotional than me. She was gripping my hand in fear of what we were going to see. Clenching my hand. We were watching it together. And almost immediately, I began to have these, subjective, maybe transsubjective impressions of beauty in this Pope, goodness in this Pope, and that has helped me understand. That has helped me understand what's been happening these last days. That all kinds of, even traditional people, traditionalist people, are feeling the good, decent heart in this man. They're subjectively feeling it. I think that our hopes are going to prove true. I've just been reading something from Joseph Shaw today that I think is very, very good, where he says words to the effect that we can expect not to be hated. We traditionalists can expect not to be hated by this Pope, and there's a big difference there. I really believe that this man wants to listen. Pope Leo wants to listen. I believe that he is a contemplative listener. And, even if he has all kinds of liberal, processes going on, some of which might even be good, and what do I mean by that? Well, I'll say this last thing about Pope Leo for now. Some will be concerned that, to use this American expression, that he will be a social justice warrior. But I would say, well, what's wrong with that? I don't really know why in the kinds of annals of, American traditionalism, being a warrior for social justice is a bad thing. Yes, of course I'm aware that, some of these so-called social justice warriors are, warriors, to kill the unborn and things like that. But abortion is not social justice. I'm all in favor of a pope who is fighting for true social justice. And I do have a sense that here some of the positive aspects of the Pope Francis Papacy, a genuine concern for the poor. A genuine concern for the poor. There's also the matter of genuine concern for the suffering of migrants. This is something, ladies and gentlemen, that is completely different from, I've spoken out actually about capitalist, engineered mass migration for the purposes of serving capitalism. I'm not at all backing, that kind of agenda, those set of agendas. Mass migration, simply to serve global capitalism. But that is something very different from the genuine plight of migrants truly suffering. So there's a difference there. There's a difference there. Look, we're not going to say a lot more. I just want to say that, yes, I do feel that we have a Pope who is likely to stand up to global capitalism, and I celebrate that as well. All right, I don't think we're going to have a lot more to say about Pope Leo in this episode, but I mentioned saying more about the danger of synodality. And we're going to go into an unusual section now, before we end, where I try to combine two apparently very different worlds. The grave concern for synodality in the Church, and the thinking here of ValentinTomberg. And here I'm trying to speak to two very different types of audience I have on this channel, ladies and gentlemen, because there will be some of you who are very gravely concerned about synodality in the Church and aren't at all interested in ValentinTomberg, and there may be some of you who aren't at all really concerned about the grave danger of synodality in the Church, but actually watch these videos for what I have to say about ValentinTomberg. And sometimes at the end of these videos, I put in a section for my audience that is interested in ValentinTomberg's thinking. And here we have a passage that we're going to reflect on that is actually relevant to both types of person. So if you're not interested in Tomberg, I want to encourage you to listen, because here you might find that he has something relevant to say to the very things we've been saying about the grave challenges that Pope Leo faces. But, if you're not interested in synodality, you might be interested in considering this simply because you're interested in Tomberg. And just to sort of crudely define synodality, I'm not even sure half the time how to define what the Church is doing there. It's been often expressed in ambiguous terms, but put crudely and simply, Pope Francis initiated a process in recent years of trying to go for a more decentralized church, a more collegial church, a church that would be more democratized, very much bringing in the laity and so on and so forth. And we don't really know where that's all headed. But what I would say now is that this kind of thinking was very prevalent after Vatican II. There was this great demand for democratization of the Church, for collegiality. They weren't so much speaking about synodality then, but it was the same basic spirit. And in his final years, ValentinTomberg really made quite a number of statements and passages to really speak about why this, he considered, was such a terrible idea. And we will not go into it all right now, but I will say that I have his final book here called Covenant of the Heart. It's now being reissued under another title, Lazarus Come Forth, but I have the old edition, Covenant of the Heart. And I'm going to read from that. I'm going to qualify. I'm going to read one key passage. But if you study these final readings in Covenant of the Heart or Lazarus Come Forth, you will see that he comes back to this again and again and again. I'll say this, ladies and gentlemen. Tomberg, I think, knew he was nearing the end of his life. In his previous magnum opus, he made the statement that he had to renounce many things that he wished he could speak about. I think this applies even more to this book, his final book. He's very consciously choosing what he has to say, and what he cannot say due to limitations of time. That was already apparent, in the magnum opus before that. It's more apparent here, and here he really turns to the crisis in the church. This is the late 60s, early 70s, he's writing this. The crisis in the church that he says is headed towards the abyss. Yes, I took that phrase from Tomberg about the church being headed towards the abyss. It's how he speaks about it here. Look, I'm just going to read you this passage from the very late ValentinTomberg about this whole issue of synodality, even though it was being spoken more in terms of collegiality and democratization and different language then. We're going to throw this into the mix, and then there'll be a few more comments for those of you who maybe this speaks to or who are interested in ValentinTomberg. So I may truncate the passage a little bit because it's long and dense, but not to change the meaning, obviously. So, he's also speaking about hermits here, and I didn't realize that when I started this video speaking about hermits with a broadcasting tower or seeing ourselves as hermits. I wasn't thinking about reading this. You might think I was, but I wasn't. Although, yeah, it is relevant. It is relevant. I do, in some way, see myself as a hermit, Kim as a hermit, although I'm sure that the exalted way he speaks about hermits here, I'm sure not at all claiming to be worthy of that. But he's speaking, in addition, you'll see what I'm getting at. As he begins to move towards synodality, he's speaking about the need and the role in the world of Christian hermits. And yes, I can aspire towards this. I think that I am called to a life of real solitude and contemplation. I may say more about that later. But anyway, here we go. The Christianity of the hermits, he writes, was no passing phenomenon limited to a few centuries only. Today it still lives with all the intensity of its youth, though it may not be deserts and thick forests into which one can retire into an undisturbed solitude. Nowadays, there are still people who have found or created in the deserts of the great cities and among the thickets of the crowds a solitude and stillness of the life for the spirit. And as before, their striving is devoted toward becoming a witness for the truth of Christianity. And you see now, this is where he begins to speak in terms relevant to synodality. The way into the depths has not led them to an individualistic brand of belief, but has given them unshakable security in the truth of the Christian revelation, as transmitted and taught by the Church. They know the truth of the following: extra ecclesiam non est salus. There is no salvation outside the Church. The Holy Father is not and cannot be the mouthpiece of an ecumenical council. This is what Tomberg was fearing would emerge out of Vatican II as Pope Paul VI began initiating these synods, that the Holy Father's role would be reduced. This is what he's getting at here. I'll read it again. These hermits know the Holy Father is not and cannot be, simply the mouthpiece of an ecumenical council. The Holy See alone can make decisions in questions of faith and of morals. A majority of the bishops cannot do so, and even less can a majority of priests or congregations do so. To say nothing here about laity. I don't have all the ins and outs of this synodal process pioneered by Pope Francis at my fingertips here, but it's clearly about a democratization that is, giving leading roles to the laity. It's going even further. Everything I've seen suggests it's going further than what Tomberg is warning us about in his last days. So a majority of the bishops cannot do so, and even less can a majority of priests or congregations do so. The Church is hierarchic theocratic, not democratic, aristocratic, or monarchic, and will be so in all future times. The Church is the civitas Dei, the city of God, and not a superstructure of the will of people belonging to the Church. Here he's been reflecting on, Marxism, and how Marxism, speaks about, things like the will of the people, the economic needs, creating these kinds of superstructures. You can't look at the Church in Marxist terms like this. This is the subtext that Tomberg is speaking from. As little as the shepherd follows the will of the herd, does the Holy Father of the Church merely carry out the collective will of his flock. I'll say again, in the whole book there are more passages about this, warning us that, the Holy Father cannot carry out, the democratic will of his flock. This is just one. Read the whole book and you'll see how it ties in with other things he's saying, but we don't have time for all that. The shepherd of the Church is St. Peter, representing Christ. His pronouncements ex cathedra are infallible, and the power of the keys of the kingdom of heaven belongs to him and him alone. These kinds of things shocked, or they should have shocked, Tomberg's former anthroposophists, except the former anthroposophists, we've been speaking about this in the Tomberg channel, they often ignore things like this. They don't take these things in. When Tomberg makes comments that, the keys of the kingdom of heaven belong to St. Peter and St. Peter alone. In other words, and he's coming back to Hermits now, those who become solitary in order to seek profundity may reach on their path of spiritual experience to the unshakable insight that the dogmas of the Church are absolutely true. Again, those of you who are reading Tomberg's early works, which he did not want republished, his early anthroposophical works that he did not want republished, I really pray you have to factor these things in, of what the late Tomberg came to think. And huge digression to Tomberg territory now, but again, my Tomberg videos are all about that this is not happening. In part due to the fact that these early Tomberg books that are not Catholic have been republished against his will. Huge topic. I'm sorry, I apologize for losing those of you who are not into Tomberg. And anyway, and so it can happen that, as they did at the time of the Arian darkening of the Church, so he means the 4th century here with the, Arian heresy, the hermits of today may again come to the assistance of the Holy See, leaving their solitude to appear as witnesses to the truth of Peter's throne and its infallible teaching. And then he goes into some sayings about, these very, very great hermits, St. Anthony of Thebes and St. Athanasius, very, very few hermits are as great as these hermits were. But you can aspire to be a hermit even if you're never going to be, a St. Athanasius or a St. Anthony. But he points to the role back then in the 4th century that the hermits played in saving the Church from the Arian heresy. Final couple of lines here. The darkening which today is described as the present crisis of the Catholic Church, I would say before St. John Paul II rescued us from the abyss. Sorry, I won't interpolate myself again. I'll just read it. The darkening which today is described as the present crisis of the Catholic Church can lead to the necessity for the solitary sons of the Church to hurry to the aid of the Holy Father, the most solitary of solitaries, in order to save the Church from the abyss towards which she is moving. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to the end of this episode with a more personal section about my wife and myself, where I'm going to expand, or try to expand, on the cryptic words I started with at the beginning about hermits with a broadcasting tower. What do I mean by that? Well, before I come to that, I think I should say that even though I am going to be speaking more personally now, within the personal comments I'm about to make, there is going to be an appeal for support. You need to know that up front, whether it's through the Buy Me a Coffee scheme or whether it's through the Substack that I mentioned, which will be free at first, but there will be a subscriber section there when we can get that going. But yeah, for those of you who care about this channel and you get to the end of these videos, I'm going to say some longer comments here. You may have already heard by getting to the end of these videos that Kim and I, we have frankly said that, like many people in the world, maybe quite like yourself, we are struggling to make ends meet. And what do we do about that? What we've decided to do is to appeal for some kind of support for the work of this little apostolate. But in appealing for that support, we needed to sort of ask ourselves, well, what are we really doing here? What are we really appealing for? We don't want to misrepresent to any of you what this appeal is really about. And as we spoke about this, it's led into a deeper contemplation about what our whole lives are about. So this description, hermits with a broadcasting tower, has depths to it that I don't know if I can fully convey to you. But I'll say this, ladies and gentlemen. I'm 62 years old this year, and I've said things like this before on the channel. You get to this age, and hopefully you're really thinking about what are the most important things you can do with the remaining years of your life. I wasn't thinking like that when I was 30 or 40, I'm thinking about it now. Who knows how long I have? And I feel like what I'm engaged with, I myself am engaged with, are certain kinds of projects that need doing, in my view, that don't necessarily have much popular support, and yet I feel I need to do them. And I've alluded to these before. I need to do, for example, work with ValentinTomberg's legacy, or Hilaire Belloc's legacy, or work with Ireland and Irish history and Irish culture. All of that is coming more to the fore on this channel. We'll be speaking a lot more about Ireland, I believe, a lot more. And yet, these are kinds of, minority interests. My Tomberg people listening to me about Tomberg aren't necessarily interested in what I have to say about Ireland. Irish people are not necessarily interested in what I have to say about Belloc. But I feel certain projects that I need to go ever more deeply into, and they also involve writing books. There's a book to do with Tomberg that's in the works. I'm struggling to find a way to keep going with it. And I want to write about Ireland. I want to write about all kinds of things. And I want to keep offering these broadcasts, if you like. Sometimes those of you who know this channel know that I speak about tragic aspects of what the French call GAFA. Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and an acronym, GAFA, for these major American tech companies and internet companies, and there are serious dangers there. But through the miracle of GAFA, I'm able to speak to the world. I'm able to speak to the world. At least, a very, very narrow slice of the world. I'm able to broadcast. Maybe a better term would be I'm able to narrowcast. Narrowcast a message to, a small number of people. And it seems to me, that Kim and I find ourselves in a position that we're looking at the experiences, the work we've done over the course of our lives. We're speaking about this on the episodes we're doing together, our travels through Europe, in my case through America, the fruits of our lives, and finding a way to hopefully relate these fruits in a way that might be of help, to a few people out there. They're never going to be, incredible best-selling fruits, But Kim and I are seeking a way to continue living modestly. Continue living really very modestly, that will support these books and these videos to keep going out. Kim is also in the process of writing a book or two herself. And it has seemed to us after much prayer that this is the way forward to make this step. It's been an uncomfortable step, first onto Buy Me a Coffee, but we are now going on to Substack. Just a few more words about Substack. As I said, I am excited about Substack. I see that there are potentials there that the website that we do has never allowed us to do. The YouTube channel has never allowed us to do. There are things that I hope will be interesting, maybe even exciting for some of you. We are intending to create a presence there, a daily presence through the, notes section at least, the sort of social media side of Substack. So this is like a new branching out of this apostolate. We're going to be broadcasting, or if you like, narrowcasting through Substack. I'll just say a word about narrowcasting for a second. I came across this word many, many years ago, and it's never been taken up, but I thought it was a good word. This is back in the 80s, and it's like, up until that time, there had been these big hegemons, the BBC in Britain, or, the three big broadcasting companies in America, ABC, NBC, CBS, and people were beginning to speak about it's no longer about broadcasting, it's about narrowcasting. And the word was never picked up, but I thought it was a good one. We are now living in a world where all kinds of people can narrowcast. They can cast what they have to say to, not the masses, but maybe a small slice of the population that can appreciate it. So maybe I should say hermits with a narrowcasting tower. But yeah, I guess what I'm really getting at here is that what I say on this channel, what I say in my books, I want to be born from contemplation. I don't want to get into the fast, furious videos turned out every single day with lots of clickbait and sensationalism. I need to do these videos and my books in a contemplative way. This is very, minority. Anyway, I won't keep rehearsing this. After prayer, the way we have decided to go forward with this is to ask your support for this little apostolate. And at the moment, if you want to support us, the way is buy me a coffee, and there are one-off donations there. But we also do have a membership scheme of patrons with exclusive content there that we are calling angels and archangels and so on and so forth. And I want to make the point that even though we're moving on to Substack, they're going to be interchangeable. In other words, if you support us, say, as a member at Buy Me a Coffee, you will automatically get a Substack membership so that you can follow us at Substack as well. It's actually going to be cheaper for you, if you're interested, to support us at Buy Me a Coffee, because Buy Me a Coffee takes a smaller cut of the takings. Substack takes a bigger cut, so yeah, I'll just say that. If you ever want to be a member, be an angel to us, be a patron, the least expensive way to do it is going to be Buy Me a Coffee, and the programs will be interchangeable. But anyway, for the moment, we are at Buy Me a Coffee. There is a members group there. There are exclusive podcasts going up every month. And before long, all of that will also be available through Substack as well. So, in closing, I would like to ask you to take a look at Buy Me a Coffee. Maybe look at the program for members or patrons or angels or archangels. There's a link down below for what we already have going with Buy Me a Coffee. But also, I want to ask you to take a look at our Substack. And Substack also has subscriptions, but if you know Substack, you know that there are free subscriptions, and that's the only kind that's available now, the free subscriptions. Later on, there will be some paid subscriptions with extra content. I hope that's clear. So, please, if you can, take a look at what we're doing at Buy Me a Coffee. and take a look at what we're doing at Substack. I will also just mention that, of course, another way to support us is through buying my books at my Amazon at my Amazon author page. As I've said many times before, I think the books are the best thing that I do, and I'm seeking to write more of them. And another way you can support us is, just going to Amazon and buying one of the books. I would like to think in that way you might get a treat for yourself and you might support us in the process. If you've got this far, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say thank you for listening, and God bless you.